The doctors had already moved away from the bed. The monitors were turned off. The room had gone completely quiet, the kind of quiet that only settles in when every person in that room has accepted that there is nothing more they can do. A man in a suit stood against the wall with both hands pressed over his mouth. A senior doctor pointed toward the door. A nurse stared down at the floor. The baby boy had not been breathing for 4 minutes, and every effort to bring him back had failed. Then a boy in a torn gray shirt walked through the door. Nobody paid attention to him at first. He was around 11 years old, small for his age, wearing muddy shoes, carrying with him the kind of stillness that comes from spending too much time going unnoticed by the world. He had followed the ambulance on foot from 3 blocks away because he had seen the father sprinting down the street, and something deep inside him said to run too. He reached the sink before anyone could stop him. What took place in the next 60 seconds would be talked about, written about, and retold in that hospital for years. Before we go further, if you believe that courage does not belong to any one kind of person and that kindness does not require a title or a uniform, please like this video, subscribe to The Real Storytellers, and pass this along to someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist. The boy's name was Eli. He was 11 years old, and for the past 8 months he had been living without a real home. Not entirely on the streets, but close enough to know what that felt like. He moved between a church shelter that closed its doors at 7 every morning and a dry patch of ground beneath an overpass that he had turned into something as close to a room as cardboard floors and a concrete ceiling would allow. He carried a backpack, inside it with 3 things: a clean pair of socks, a photograph of his mother, and a small book about the human body that he had pulled from a donation box outside a clinic 2 years earlier, a book he had read so many times that the binding had completely split open. That book matters. Keep it in mind. Eli had been drawn to medicine from the age of 6. That was when his younger sister stopped breathing for nearly a full minute during a severe allergic reaction. A paramedic had arrived and brought her back, calm hands, steady movements, working with a kind of quiet precision that to Eli looked like the most important thing he had ever seen one person do for another. He made up his mind that day. He wanted to understand how the body worked, what went wrong, what could fix it. Without regular access to school, without a library card that stayed active when you had no fixed address, he learned from whatever he could get his hands on: donated health pamphlets, outdated medical textbooks left outside college buildings, and that worn-out book about the human body, which contained a chapter on infant emergencies, a chapter that explained exactly what to do when a baby had taken in fluid and the airway needed to be cleared before the lungs could begin working again. He had read that chapter many times. He had never once thought he would need it. The morning it happened started like most Eli's mornings. He was sitting near the entrance of Elm Park, 2 blocks from Cedar Ridge Memorial Hospital, eating half a granola bar he had set aside from the shelter the night before, watching the city come to life around him. He noticed the man first, expensive suit, running the way men in expensive suits almost never run, completely letting go, with no thought of who might be watching because something had pushed aside everything else except the emergency happening right in front of him. The man was holding a small bundle pressed tightly against his chest. Eli stood up. He did not fully understand why, he just did, and he followed. The entrance to the hospital was 3 blocks. By the time Eli got there, the man had already been rushed through the emergency doors. Eli slipped in behind a family walking through the same entrance and followed the sound of raised voices down a hallway and through a set of doors that were still swinging back and forth. He walked into the room just as the senior doctor raised his hand and began to say the words no parent ever wants to hear. The baby, 8 months old, had been found unresponsive at home. Early signs pointed to the baby having inhaled fluid while sitting in a bouncy chair that had tilted during a brief moment the father stepped into the next room. By the time the father found him, too much time had already passed. The medical team had been working on him for 4 minutes after he arrived, with no response. The man in the suit, the father, was pressed flat against the wall. His name was Nathan Caldwell. He had spent 20 years recognizing people who had something rare and then creating the conditions for that thing to grow. He had simply never found that person in a hospital corridor, 11 years old, with a split-spined book tucked inside a worn-out backpack. Eli had noticed something the instant he stepped into that room. A faint movement, the most barely there twitch in the baby's fingers, so small that everyone else had already looked past it. He did not stop to explain himself. He did not ask for anyone's permission. He crossed the room carefully but without a moment of hesitation, gently lifted the infant and held him face up under a slow, steady stream of cool water, exactly the way the book had described. He supported the head and neck with steady hands, handling the small body so that gravity could help the airway open and clear. That was when the doctor pointed at him and raised his voice. That was when the man in the suit said, "What are you doing?" That was when the nurse began moving towards him. Eli did not let go. He said, quietly, without turning around, "Please, just give me 1 minute." Something about the way he said it stopped everyone in the room cold. Not because he was loud, not because he had any authority, but because of something else entirely, a steadiness that only comes from a person who is not pretending to be confident, but actually is. Confidence earned through 2 years of reading the same chapter again and again on a concrete floor beneath an overpass, because the human body fascinated him, and because knowledge was the one thing that no difficult circumstance had ever been able to take away from him. 40 seconds passed. Then the baby coughed, then cried. Then the room erupted into motion all at once, doctors rushing forward, monitors being reconnected, the nurse who had been walking towards him stopping completely where she stood, one hand placed over her heart. Nathan Caldwell slid down the wall until he was sitting on the hospital floor, his face buried in his hands, making a sound that was not quite crying and not quite anything else, just a father coming back from the edge of the worst moment of his life. Eli gently laid the baby down on the exam table, stepped back, and picked up his backpack from where he had set it down by the door. He was almost in the hallway when Nathan looked up and said, "Wait. Before we go on, we want to stop here because what Eli did in that hospital room is the most visible part of this story, but the real storytellers wants you to understand what made it possible." 2 years before that morning, sometime in early 2019, a clinic volunteer named Margaret left a box of donated books outside the building at the end of a long shift. She had not sorted through them carefully. She had not thought much about who might come along and take one. She simply left them rather than throwing them away, because throwing out books felt wrong to her. Eli found that box at 6:30 in the morning. He took one book. A retired paramedic named Raymond ran informal first aid sessions at the Grace Bridge shelter on the second Sunday of every month. He opened them up to anyone who wanted to come. He didn't check whether the people attending had a home address. Eli showed up to 3 of those sessions. Raymond walked the group through how the airway works and what body position matters most when a baby can't breathe. Raymond never learned Eli's name. Eli never forgot what Raymond showed him. A shelter supervisor named Gloria used to let Eli stay an extra 40 minutes past the shelter's closing time on cold mornings, whenever she could tell he had nowhere warm to go. She never wrote it down. She never logged it anywhere. She simply did not lock the door until he had finished whatever he was reading. None of these people were standing in that hospital room, but all of them were there. This is what the real storytellers believes, that every single act of decency travels further than the person who gave it will ever find out. Margaret's box of books, Raymond's second Sunday sessions, Gloria's unlocked door, they all walked into that room with Eli. Nathan Caldwell found Eli in the hallway. He had left his infant son in the care of the medical team, stepped out and stood before this boy with an expression that had nothing polished about it, nothing controlled, just a man who had been brought to the edge of the worst thing imaginable and pulled back because a child in a torn shirt had refused to accept what everyone else in that room had already accepted. He asked Eli where he lived. Eli told him the truth. Nathan did not respond with pity. He did not display the particular kind of discomfort that people sometimes show when poverty gets close enough to feel personal. He asked Eli 2 more questions. What do you want to do with your life? And what do you need to do it? Eli answered both. What came next was not charity. Nathan made that clear from the beginning, and Eli made clear he would not have accepted it that way. It was an investment. Nathan had spent 20 years recognizing people who had something rare and then creating the conditions for that thing to grow. He had simply never before found that person in a hospital corridor, 11 years old, with a split-spined book tucked inside a worn-out backpack. Eli was enrolled in school within the month. By November 2021, he went to live with a foster family that Nathan's foundation had supported for years. A couple named the Mensa Coopers, who had 3 other children, a loud and warm kitchen, and the kind of home where the front door was left unlocked because someone was always about to walk through it. He was given time with a tutor twice a week, a library card, a winter coat. He asked if he could keep the book about the human body. No one had ever suggested he couldn't. 4 years later, Eli was the top science student in his school. At 14, he attended a regional medical symposium in the spring of 2023 as the only middle school student in the room. He sat in the front row. He asked 2 questions during the session that the presenting doctor later told a colleague were the sharpest, most precise questions anyone had asked all day. Nathan's son, now 5 years old, had a nickname for Eli that had developed naturally over years of visits and could not quite be put into regular adult words. What it meant, roughly, was the person who stayed, because that is what Eli had done. When every other person in that room stepped away, he stayed. The night before Eli's first day of high school, in September 2025, he sat at the Mensa Cooper kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to Nathan, not to the doctors. He wrote to Margaret, whose full name he had eventually tracked down by tracing the clinic donation box back to where it had come from. He wrote to Raymond, the paramedic, now retired and living in a smaller town 2 hours away. He wrote to Gloria, the shelter supervisor. He told each of them what their small decisions had made possible. Margaret wrote back within the week. She said she had not thought about that box of books in 2 years and that she had cried for 20 minutes after reading his letter and then called her sister just so she could read it to her again. Raymond wrote back on paper so old it had turned yellow at the edges. He said that he had run those second Sunday sessions for 11 years and that this was the first time he had ever heard what happened after. Gloria did not write back, but the shelter director told Eli several months later that Gloria had framed the letter and hung it on the wall right next to the door she used to leave unlocked on cold mornings, the door she still left unlocked. Never count someone out based on where they slept last night. Never assume that because someone has nothing, they know nothing. Never mistake quiet for empty or worn-out shoes for a small life. And never forget that the knowledge capable of saving a life might be sitting in a box left on a pavement by someone who simply could not bring herself to throw it away. If this story reached you, please like this video, leave a comment below, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that people can still be genuinely good. Subscribe to The Real Storytellers for more stories of courage, strength, and the quiet everyday decisions that end up changing everything.
because kindness does not always show up in a white coat. Sometimes it walks in wearing a torn gray shirt, carrying a book with a broken spine, and it stays long after everyone else has walked away.